My husband called his private security to throw me out of my own company. But then, the board meeting was supposed to be routine. Instead, my husband stood up in front of everyone and calmly announced that I was no longer welcome in the company I helped build. Before I could even respond, he made a call. Minutes later, 2 private security guards walked into the conference room. "Escort her out," he said coldly. The room went silent as the guards approached me. Some employees looked shocked. Others avoided eye contact. My husband thought he had already won. What he didn't realize was that the documents he signed months earlier, the ones he barely read, had already changed everything. So as the guards reached my chair, I simply smiled. Because the next person leaving that building wasn't going to be me. If this story helps you understand that arrogance always costs more than people expect, please like and subscribe. There are moments when someone's arrogance becomes so complete that they make catastrophic miscalculation based on assumption that you're powerless and ignorant, when they become so confident in their control and their authority that they stop paying attention to details that would reveal their position isn't as secure as they believe. When attempt to publicly humiliate you actually becomes moment when their own vulnerabilities are exposed and their power collapses because they underestimated you so completely they never thought to verify the assumptions their plans were built on. The moment my husband Marcus stood up in board meeting and announced I was no longer welcome in the company I'd co-founded with him 15 years earlier, the moment he called private security to escort me out of the building in front of our employees and our board members, was the moment when his arrogance peaked and when everything he'd been planning to take from me collapsed because of documents he'd signed months earlier without reading carefully. Documents that had fundamentally shifted the power dynamics between us in ways he'd never understood or verified before making his move against me. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'm 42 years old. I'd been married to Marcus for 17 years when he attempted to have me forcibly removed from the technology company we'd built together. 17 years during which I'd progressively realized that Marcus viewed me more as useful resource than as equal partner, that his respect for me was contingent on my being subordinate to him rather than being based on genuine recognition of my capabilities and my contributions. Marcus was 45, had always been ambitious and status-conscious in ways that had initially seemed like drive and confidence, but that had revealed themselves over time to be more about ego and control than about genuine leadership or vision. The company we'd built together was a software development firm specializing in enterprise solutions for healthcare industry. Business we'd started in our apartment 15 years earlier, with combined savings of $50,000 and idea for product that would streamline medical records management. The company had grown successfully over the years and was now worth approximately $28 million, employed 60 people, had clients across healthcare industry, and generated comfortable profits that had made Marcus and me both wealthy. The pattern that had developed as the company had grown was that Marcus had progressively positioned himself as primary public face and decision-maker, while my contributions had become less visible and less acknowledged, had been increasingly relegated to technical and operational aspects that were critical to company success, but that didn't generate the public recognition and status that Marcus craved. I'd initially accepted this division partly because I genuinely preferred technical work to public relations, and partly because I'd believed we were partners working toward shared goals, and that specific division of responsibilities didn't matter as long as we were both contributing to company's success. But over the past several years, Marcus's behavior had shifted from partnership toward something more controlling and more dismissive. He'd started making major business decisions without consulting me, had begun describing himself in interviews and presentations as founder of the company without mentioning my co-founder role, had been increasingly critical of my work and my judgment in ways that seemed designed to undermine my confidence and my standing within the company. The pattern had been subtle enough that I'd rationalized it for a long time as just Marcus being stressed or as misunderstandings that could be addressed through better communication. The crisis that had brought everything to head had begun 6 months before the board meeting, when Marcus had announced that he wanted to restructure the company's ownership and governance to professionalize management and position the company for potential acquisition or public offering. He'd presented detailed restructuring plan that would reorganize our equity ownership, would create new governance structure with formal board of directors, would establish clearer reporting lines and decision-making authority. The plan had seemed reasonable on surface. Growing companies often needed more formal structures as they scaled, and having clear governance would make the company more attractive to potential acquirers or investors. Marcus had hired expensive corporate attorney to draft all the necessary documentation, had presented me with stack of legal documents to review and sign, had been somewhat impatient and dismissive when I'd asked questions about specific provisions or implications. What Marcus hadn't known I'd done because he'd assumed I would just sign whatever documents he presented without sophisticated legal review, was hire my own attorney to review everything Marcus was proposing before I signed anything. The attorney I'd hired was specialist in corporate law and equity structures, someone who could identify provisions that might be disadvantageous to me or that might shift power in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the surface language. My attorney's review had revealed that Marcus's restructuring plan was designed to progressively dilute my ownership stake and my decision-making authority while consolidating his control over the company. The plan included provisions that would allow majority shareholder to force buyout of minority shareholders under certain conditions, would give board chair, position Marcus would hold, authority to make certain major decisions without full board approval, would establish compensation structures that would benefit Marcus disproportionately while limiting my financial gains from company's growth. Armed with my attorney's analysis, I'd negotiated significant changes to Marcus's proposed restructuring before agreeing to sign anything. The changes I'd insisted on included maintaining my 50% equity ownership explicitly rather than allowing any provisions that could dilute my stake without my consent, requiring unanimous shareholder approval for any major corporate actions including sales, mergers, or changes to equity structure. Establishing my position as permanent board member with specific authorities that couldn't be removed without my consent, including provisions that would trigger significant financial penalties if either partner attempted to force the other out of the company without cause. Marcus had been frustrated by my insistence on these changes and by my refusal to just sign his original documents, but he'd ultimately agreed to the modifications I demanded because he'd needed my signature to proceed with the restructuring, and because he'd apparently believed that the changes I was asking for were largely symbolic and wouldn't actually limit his ability to control the company the way he wanted to. What Marcus had fundamentally misunderstood was that the provisions I'd insisted on weren't just protective measures for my existing position. They were structural safeguards that would make it legally and financially impossible for him to remove me from the company or to diminish my role without my consent and without catastrophic financial consequences for himself and for the company. Over the 6 months following the restructuring, Marcus had been increasingly open about his dissatisfaction with our partnership and his desire to have full control of the company without having to accommodate my input or my authority. He'd been making comments to other executives about how the company would be more efficient if there was single clear leader rather than co-founders who sometimes disagreed, had been gradually excluding me from important meetings and decisions, had been positioning himself with the board and with key employees as the visionary leader whose plans were being held back by my conservative approach and my resistance to his ideas. What I'd understood from Marcus's behavior was that he was building toward some kind of move against me, was creating narrative that would justify removing me from leadership role or from the company entirely. But I'd been confident that the legal protections I'd built into our restructuring documents would prevent him from actually succeeding in whatever he was planning, would ensure that any attempt to force me out would backfire spectacularly. The board meeting where Marcus made his move had been scheduled as routine quarterly review, normal gathering of our 5 board members, Marcus and me as co-founders, plus 3 outside directors we'd recruited as part of the restructuring. The meeting had proceeded normally through standard agenda items, financial review, operational updates, discussion of strategic priorities, and then Marcus had deviated from the agenda. "There's one more item I need to address," Marcus had announced, standing up in a way that immediately created tension in the room. "I've made difficult decision that I believe is necessary for the company's future success. Effective immediately, Victoria will be stepping down from all operational roles in the company and will be resigning from the board. Her equity ownership will remain for now, but her involvement in day-to-day operations and in strategic decision-making needs to end." The room had gone silent. The outside board members had looked shocked and confused. This hadn't been on the agenda, hadn't been discussed or previewed, was clearly Marcus acting unilaterally rather than following proper governance procedures. I'd sat quietly, waiting to see how far Marcus would take this before I responded. "Victoria's approach to the business has become increasingly misaligned with the direction the company needs to go," Marcus had continued. "She's been resistant to necessary changes, has been blocking initiatives that would drive growth, has been creating dysfunction within the leadership team. I've tried to work with her to address these issues, but it's become clear that the company will be better served if she steps away and allows me to lead without the constant conflict and obstruction." One of the outside directors had tried to interrupt, had started to say that this kind of major change required proper process and board discussion and couldn't just be announced unilaterally. But Marcus had cut him off. "This isn't up for discussion. I'm implementing this change as founder and CEO. Victoria can maintain her equity stake for now, but she needs to leave the building immediately and discontinue her involvement in company operations." And then Marcus had pulled out his phone and made a call. Within minutes, 2 private security guards had entered the conference room. They were contractors Marcus had apparently hired specifically for this purpose, not our regular building security who knew me and who would have been uncomfortable with being asked to remove me. Marcus had pointed at me and had said coldly, "Escort her out of the building. She's no longer authorized to be here." The guards had approached my chair while the room sat in stunned silence. Some of our employees who could see into the glass-walled conference room had stopped what they were doing to watch what was happening. Marcus had been standing with his arms crossed, confident and satisfied, apparently believing he'd successfully removed me from the company and established himself as sole leader. I'd remained seated and calm, had pulled out my own phone, and had made a call to our corporate attorney. Not the one Marcus had hired for the restructuring, but the one I'd retained separately to protect my interests. "We're implementing the safeguard provisions we discussed," I'd said simply. "Please file the documentation immediately." Then I'd looked at Marcus and had said loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "You should probably sit down. Your security guards won't be escorting me out, but you might want to have your personal attorney on standby, because what happens next is going to be expensive for you personally." Marcus had looked confused and then angry. "You don't have any authority here anymore. I'm CEO and I'm implementing this change. Leave now or you'll be removed by force." I'd smiled and had addressed the board members rather than Marcus. What Marcus apparently forgot when he signed our restructuring documents 6 months ago is that we included provisions requiring unanimous shareholder approval for any changes to board composition or operational roles of either co-founder. He can't remove me from the board or from my operational role without my consent. Furthermore, we included provisions that impose significant financial penalties on any shareholder who attempts to violate these protections. I'd pulled out my copy of the restructuring documents and had turned to the specific provisions I'd insisted on including. Section 4. 3 states that any attempt by either shareholder to force the removal of the other from board or operational roles without documented cause and without that shareholder's consent triggers mandatory buyout provision at 200% of fair market value. Section 4.5 states that the shareholder who initiates such wrongful removal attempt becomes personally liable for all costs associated with the resulting legal proceedings and must personally fund the buyout payment. The implications had been clear to everyone in the room. By attempting to force me out without following proper procedures and without my consent, Marcus had triggered provisions that would require him to personally buy out my 50% equity stake at double the company's fair market value, approximately $28 million total, which Marcus didn't have the personal liquidity to pay. Marcus had gone pale as he'd processed what I was saying and what it meant. That's not what those provisions were intended for. They were just protective measures in case of actual wrongful termination, not in case you decided you wanted sole control and tried to force me out without cause, I'd interrupted. That's exactly what those provisions were intended for. You signed them 6 months ago. Your attorney reviewed them. You agreed to every word. And now you've triggered them by attempting to remove me from the company in violation of our shareholder agreement. The corporate attorney I'd called had arrived at the building and had joined the board meeting. She'd confirmed everything I'd said about the provisions and their implications, had presented documentation showing that I was filing formal claim under the protective provisions Marcus had violated, had made clear that Marcus's options were either to immediately retract his attempted removal and to pay substantial penalty for having violated the agreement, or to proceed with forced buyout that would require him to pay approximately $28 million to purchase my equity stake, money he didn't have, and would need to raise by selling the company or by taking on debt that would destroy the business. The board meeting had dissolved into chaos as Marcus and the outside directors had tried to process what had happened and what the implications were. The security guards had left, confused about who they were actually supposed to be removing, and Marcus had been forced to face reality that his attempt to remove me from the company I'd built with him had backfired catastrophically because he'd signed documents without understanding their full implications, and because he'd underestimated me so completely he'd never thought to verify what protections I'd built in before making his move. The resolution that emerged over the following weeks was that Marcus couldn't afford to buy me out at the penalty rate the provisions required, couldn't raise the capital without destroying the company, and was forced instead to accept significant restructuring that actually increased my authority and reduced his. The board voted to remove Marcus as CEO while maintaining him as board member with reduced operational role, installed me as CEO with clear authority over business operations and strategic direction, imposed probation period during which Marcus would need to demonstrate he could work collaboratively or face further consequences. The professional and personal consequences for Marcus were severe and lasting. His reputation within the company was damaged by the exposure of his attempt to force me out. Several key employees who'd been loyal to him were disturbed by his willingness to violate agreements and to try to remove me improperly. His standing with the board was compromised by his poor judgment and his failure to understand the legal protections he'd agreed to. Our marriage ended shortly after. There was no possibility of personal relationship continuing after he'd tried to destroy my professional position and had been willing to publicly humiliate me to achieve his goals. 3 years after the board meeting where Marcus tried to have me escorted out by security, I'm 45 and serving as sole CEO of the company we built together. Marcus sold his equity stake to me at fair market value, not at the penalty rate, but through negotiated settlement that allowed him to exit more cleanly than the full enforcement of the protective provisions would have required, and is no longer involved in the business. The company has grown and thrived under my leadership, has expanded into new markets and new products, has built culture based on collaboration and respect rather than on ego and control. What I learned from Marcus's catastrophic miscalculation is that arrogance always costs more than people expect, that underestimating someone while simultaneously depending on legal agreements you haven't read carefully is recipe for spectacular failure, that protective provisions built into contracts before you need them can be difference between being powerless victim of someone else's manipulation and being person who holds all the power when they finally make their move. Marcus thought he could remove me from company we built together because he assumed I was less sophisticated and less prepared than he was. What he discovered was that I'd been protecting myself for months, through legal structures he'd signed but never understood, that his attempt to publicly humiliate me by having security escort me out actually became moment when his own power collapsed and mine was fully revealed. My name is Victoria Hayes. My husband tried to have me escorted out of the company I co-founded, called private security in front of board and employees, announced I was no longer welcome in business I'd built. What he didn't know was that documents he'd signed months earlier, the ones he'd barely read because he'd assumed I would just accept whatever he presented, had already changed everything, had built protections that made his attempted coup legally impossible and financially catastrophic for him personally. As security guards approached my chair, I smiled and made single phone call that triggered provisions Marcus had never understood. Provisions that ensured the next person leaving that building wasn't me. It was Marcus who lost his CEO position, his reputation, his marriage, and eventually his equity stake in company he'd tried to take from me. Sometimes the best protection is the one hidden in plain sight, in legal documents someone signed without reading carefully because they underestimated you so completely they never thought to verify what they were agreeing to. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that arrogance always costs more than people expect, please like and subscribe.